Leandrew McCutcheon was born on July 6, 1972, in Newcastle, New South Wales. He grew up in Wallsend, a working-class industrial suburb where few paths led far from the local trades. From an early age, he was drawn to physical activity, rugby, karate, gymnastics, and his grandfather, a former army wrestler, recognized that drive early enough to enroll him in a local police boys' gymnastics club. The more formative influence, however, was his mother, Lynn. She was not simply a supportive parent. Lynn was a competitive bodybuilder who trained seriously and brought that discipline into the household. For a boy who was already drawn to physical ideals, his mother sewed him a Superman cape each year, and made one for the family dog. Watching her build her physique through consistent, deliberate work gave that admiration a concrete direction. Lee began lifting weights at 12. By 13, he had entered and won his first bodybuilding competition, taking first place at the 1985 Sydney Bodybuilding Classic. He continued competing through his teenage years, accumulating wins against adult competitors across Australia. Standing 5 feet 4 inches, he carried a degree of muscular development that was unusual at any age, and his arms in particular drew consistent attention from coaches and competitors alike. At 16, he won the IFBB Mr. Australia title. At 17, he competed in the World Championships and placed 4th. At 19, he won Mr. Australia a second time. 3 national titles before the age at which most athletes are still developing their competitive careers. It was, by any measure, one of the most accomplished amateur records the sport had produced. The professional circuit presented a different set of conditions entirely. Winning a national title multiple times before the age of 20 would in most sports represent a clear path to professional status. In bodybuilding, the path was less straightforward. For Lee Priest, the rules governing professional certification became the first significant obstacle of his career. Despite winning the Mr. Australia title at 19, Priest was ineligible for a pro card under the age restrictions then in place by the Australian organisation. His competitive record was not in question. The organisation's position was simply that he did not yet meet the minimum age requirement. A competitor who had been winning for 6 years would have to continue as an amateur. Rather than wait out the process, Priest made the decision to leave Australia entirely. At 20 years old, he relocated to California, home to Gold's Gym Venice and the center of professional bodybuilding in the United States. He entered the Niagara Falls Championships as an amateur and placed 9th. At that event, NPC president Jim Manion saw enough in Priest's physique and stage presence to intervene directly. Priest received his pro card shortly after. At 20, he became one of the youngest men in the history of the sport to turn IFBB professional, granted entry by the same international organization that had been inaccessible to him through its Australian affiliate. When Lee Priest arrived on the American professional circuit in the early 1990s, he was not an easy figure to categorize. He was short, outspoken, Australian, and carrying a level of arm development that drew immediate attention from experienced competitors. He competed under the nickname, the Blond Myth. His arms, measuring 22 inches, were the most discussed aspect of his physique. Dense, vascular, and well-shaped, they appeared disproportionately large against his 5'4" frame. In an era defined by extreme mass, Priest offered something different. Size combined with symmetry and conditioning, wide through the shoulders, narrow at the waist, with visible striations on stage. Among bodybuilding enthusiasts, his aesthetic would continue to be referenced as a benchmark long after his competitive peak. Priest was also known for his willingness to speak openly about the sport's internal workings. While most professionals maintained carefully managed public images, Priest discussed steroid use directly at a time when federations were not publicly acknowledging its prevalence. He spoke about prize money structures he considered inadequate relative to the physical demands placed on competitors, and about the influence of politics on judging outcomes. He was by the standards of the industry unusually candid. This made him one of the most discussed figures in bodybuilding media during the mid to late 1990s. Bodybuilding publications and early internet forums followed his off-season weight, personal relationships, and rumored disputes with the consistency usually reserved for mainstream celebrities. His competitive results reflected genuine elite-level ability. He placed 5th at the Mr. Olympia in 1997, finishing ahead of Ronnie Coleman, who would go on to win the title 8 consecutive times beginning the following year. Within the sport, there was serious discussion at that point about whether Priest was capable of contending for the Sandow. His off-seasons, however, generated a different kind of discussion. By his own account, Priest treated the period between competitions as one of near-total dietary latitude. At his heaviest, he reportedly reached close to 300 pounds on a 5'4" frame. Photographs from those periods circulated widely and were difficult to reconcile with his onstage condition. For several consecutive years, Priest was reportedly named among the subjects of bodybuilding's informal online speculation about which athletes were most at risk from the demands of their lifestyle. He largely dismissed the attention publicly. The questions about long-term health consequences were not, however, without basis. At the 2002 Mr. Olympia, Lee Priest placed 6th. By any standard measure, a top 10 finish at the Olympia represents elite-level achievement, but it fell short of what his career trajectory had suggested. His placements had been inconsistent for several years, and there were people within the bodybuilding community, not just fans but insiders, who believed that Lee's outspoken nature was affecting his scores, that judges were weighing something beyond physique when they made their decisions. Lee believed that too. At the 2003 Mr. Olympia press conference, he took a public position that no professional bodybuilder had quite taken before, one that would shape the years that followed. The event's host was Wayne DeMilia, director of the IFBB Pro Division and one of the most influential figures in professional bodybuilding. DeMilia put a question to the assembled athletes about prize money, specifically, whether any of them would consider sharing their winnings with lower-placing competitors who had trained just as hard but earned nothing. Where others offered diplomatic non-answers, Lee Priest responded directly. If he won, he said, he would share his prize money with athletes who placed lower, because they had made the same sacrifices and deserved recognition. He didn't stop at saying it. He put it in writing, on stage, in front of DeMilia himself. The reaction in the room was immediate. Fans responded with genuine emotion. Fellow athletes were visibly taken aback. And Wayne DeMilia, the man who controlled the money, the shows, and the contracts, stood on that stage while one of his own contracted professionals made a public case for athlete solidarity. It was a moment of genuine human decency. It was also, in retrospect, a turning point in Lee's relationship with the Federation's leadership. That relationship had always been strained. His candid acknowledgement of drug use made the Federation uncomfortable. His public criticism of prize money put him at odds with the financial structure they were protecting. His refusal to seek approval from those in power kept him outside the circle of favored athletes. And now, in front of cameras, he had effectively criticized the sport's treatment of its lower-placing competitors, athletes who received nothing while the Federation collected its fees, in the presence of the man who ran the system. Lee Priest had put himself in direct conflict with the most powerful figure in his sport. Unlike Lee, Wayne DeMilia was a patient man. In 2004, Wayne DeMilia parted ways with the IFBB. The circumstances were layered. Disagreements with IFBB President Ben Weider, internal organizational politics, differing visions for the future of professional bodybuilding. DeMilia did not exit quietly. He launched a new organization called Pro Division Inc., or PDI, and began running his own events, including the Night of Champions, a prestigious show he had originally developed under the IFBB. This was a direct challenge to the Federation's dominance, and the IFBB's response followed the pattern of an organization that had spent decades consolidating its control. They made clear that any IFBB contracted professional who competed in a PDI event would face suspension. The rule was straightforward. Competing exclusively for the Federation was a condition of the contract. Most athletes understood the implications and kept their distance from DeMilia's shows. Competing in a rival league meant risking their career, their contracts, and their access to the sport's biggest stages. Lee Priest reached a different conclusion. In 2006, Lee won the Ironman Pro, one of the most prestigious events on the calendar, and then 2 weeks before the Olympia, entered a PDI event, the Night of Champions, followed by its British counterpart. He won both. His reasoning was consistent with positions he had been stating publicly for years. Wayne was building a new organization, Lee said. He intended to judge things differently. Lee was in condition. The events fell 2 weeks before the Olympia, and he saw no compelling reason to stay home. The idea that a professional athlete's appearance schedule should be dictated entirely by a federation that wasn't paying him, one that profited substantially from athletes' performances while paying them relatively little, seemed unreasonable to him. The IFBB suspended him for 1 year. What followed reveals something specific about Lee Priest's character. The IFBB told him that if he agreed to skip a scheduled appearance in England, they would hold the suspension to 1 year. There was a show there that Lee was committed to attending. His name was on the promotional materials. Tickets had been sold. Fans had made plans specifically because Lee Priest was expected to be there. He declined. He told the Federation to extend the suspension to 2 years if necessary. He was going to England. He had given his word to the people who had purchased tickets, and he was not going to withdraw because the Federation was applying pressure. The IFBB did extend the ban to 2 years. When that 2-year period technically ended and Lee was scheduled to return, he did not appear at the events the IFBB had designated for him. Whether this reflected indifference, continued defiance, or a deeper estrangement from an organization he had never trusted, the outcome was the same. The Federation had offered a path back, and from their perspective he had not taken it. The ban became lifetime. In 2010, the situation extended further when Lee was blocked from conducting seminars at an IFBB event in Norway. The Federation reportedly threatened to suspend every athlete entered in the event if Lee appeared. He was no longer simply banned from competition. His presence was being used as leverage against other athletes. The message was unambiguous. This is the consequence of not complying. The bodybuilding community responded strongly. Online forums and social media posts reflected widespread outrage among fans. One commenter grouped Lee Priest with Tom Platz and Mike Menser as examples of what they described as institutional corruption. Others pointed to the press conference moment, the shared prize money, and the frank drug admissions and argued that the underlying issue was never about contract violations. It was about an athlete who was too honest, too principled, and too outspoken for an organization that preferred compliance. Lee's own perspective, expressed in later interviews, was more measured. He acknowledged that technically he had violated his contract. He also pointed out that the IFBB and its international parent organization had since undergone a significant restructuring, and that in the resulting landscape he was no longer certain the ban legally applied to him. He had been told by the athlete's representative that it had essentially been voided. The situation was genuinely unclear, and Lee indicated he was uncertain whether he remained banned at all. What was clear was that a career that by most assessments should have ended with an Olympia title had instead ended in institutional exile, and the physical consequences of the life he had lived were only beginning to make themselves known. In 2014, Lee Priest was involved in a car accident that resulted in immediate damage to his neck. For most people, a neck injury is a serious but recoverable setback. For a professional bodybuilder, the implications run considerably deeper. The nerve damage from the accident spread to the muscles on his left side, and by his own later accounts, his right side was also affected. For someone whose career had been built on the precise symmetrical development of his body, visible atrophy on one side was not only a physical problem, it raised questions about identity, purpose, and what comes next. He continued training through the injury and managed the pain as best he could. He also spent years in a dispute with his insurance company, pushing for coverage of surgery that multiple medical professionals had recommended. The company denied and delayed. Eventually, Lee Priest, one of the most recognized physiques in professional bodybuilding, launched a GoFundMe campaign to cover his own medical expenses. During this period, he spoke openly about what the injury had done to him, physically and psychologically. Some of his doctors had made the situation worse, dismissing his symptoms or, as he described it, attributing the nerve damage to his history of steroid use rather than to the accident itself. He felt misunderstood and without recourse, an experience that stood in sharp contrast to the confidence and control that had defined his competitive years. He acknowledged having suicidal thoughts during this time. Bodybuilding had been more than a career for Priest. The gym was the one environment where effort produced reliable results, where he had always been in control. When that was taken from him, the impact extended well beyond the physical. He eventually raised enough through the crowdfunding campaign to undergo neck surgery, which took place in 2020, 6 years after the accident. The procedure brought some relief, but it introduced a new complication. Post-surgical pain management included a prescription for oxycodone, which is standard practice. Also well documented is that patients who take opioids for extended periods can develop a dependency before recognizing it. Priest spoke about this in subsequent interviews with considerable candor. He described the medication gradually altering his motivation, his presence, his sense of himself. The gym, which had always been a refuge, began to feel like something to avoid. He described the effect as feeling like a zombie. When he decided to stop taking the medication, he stopped without tapering. The withdrawal was severe, physical discomfort that by his account rivaled the original injury. He went through it without medical supervision, which carries its own risks, but he came through it. Across the full span of those years, the accident, the muscle atrophy, the depression, the opioid dependency, the withdrawal, Priest continued speaking publicly about what he was experiencing. That willingness to discuss his situation without filtering or softening it was consistent with how he had always operated throughout his career. Around 2004, as tensions with the IFBB were becoming difficult to manage, Lee Priest had a tribal tattoo applied to his face. He later said the decision was influenced by Mike Tyson, who had debuted a Maori-style facial tattoo in 2003 to considerable public reaction. Priest saw in that reaction something worth noting, a statement of indifference to outside opinion. He had his own tribal design applied, covering part of his face, and it became one of the more recognizable things about him in the sport. Within bodybuilding, some considered it a professional mistake, that sponsors would withdraw, that judges would factor it into their assessments, that the federation would use it as further justification to distance itself from him. Priest had heard similar concerns throughout his career, regarding his drug disclosures, his public disputes, and his off-season weight. His position on such concerns had generally been consistent. He was not particularly moved by them. The tattoo became a fixed part of his public image for years, a visible marker of the qualities he was known for: directness, individuality, and a general disregard for what the sport expected him to be. In 2019, he began having it removed. In 2022, he had a new version applied in its place. That sequence, acquisition, removal, replacement, reflects a pattern that has characterized much of Priest's life outside the competitive arena. He has not been consistent in ways that fit external expectations. He has been consistent in saying what he thinks, in presenting himself without adjustment for his audience, and in reserving the right to reverse a previous decision. His post-competitive life has been varied. He raced cars, winning the Cedar Racing Championship in California in 2006, and receiving Rookie of the Year recognition in 2005. He appeared in a horror short film Round Trip in 2018. He has written, guest posed, and maintained a regular presence on RX Muscle, commenting on the sport with the same directness that marked his time as a competitor. He also at some point acquired a pet fox named Carlos. In 2022, he posted a physique update on social media. Not an incidental photo, but a substantive demonstration that whatever the preceding years had cost him, he had returned to serious training. For a man approaching 50, the images prompted genuine attention and revived a question that had been dormant for some time: whether he might compete again. The timing coincided with discussions about a possible revival of the Masters Olympia, a division for competitors over 40. Jake Wood, the Mr. Olympia president, confirmed the division's return, and Priest's name circulated as a natural fit. The status of his IFBB lifetime ban remains somewhat unclear. Priest himself acknowledged in interviews that he was uncertain whether changes to the federation's structure had effectively rendered the ban inactive. Whether or not he returns to competition, the fact that the question is being asked at all reflects something about his standing in the sport. Nearly a decade after his last competitive appearance, his opinions carry weight, his name generates interest, and his physique still draws notice. He remains a significant figure in professional bodybuilding, not in spite of the difficulties that defined much of his later years, but in many respects because of how he handled them. At this point in the story, it is worth addressing the question that bodybuilding fans have debated for years. Could Lee Priest have won the Mr. Olympia? The honest answer is probably not, at least not in the era he competed. The Olympia of the late 1990s and early 2000s was moving toward a mass-first philosophy that rewarded sheer size in ways that did not align with Lee's aesthetic strengths. Ronnie Coleman won 8 consecutive titles during that period by becoming progressively more massive, in ways that Lee, despite his extraordinary genetics, could not match. The more significant question is a different one. Could Lee Priest have placed higher, won more shows, built a more financially rewarding career? Had he simply operated within the sport's established boundaries? Had he avoided the Wayne D'Amelia situation, declined to share his prize money on stage, and stayed within the lines the IFBB drew for its athletes? Almost certainly, yes. And Lee Priest made a deliberate choice not to. That choice cost him considerably. It cost him placements he may have deserved, shows he might have won, and the Federation's favor at the precise moments when that favor carried the most weight. It cost him his professional standing through a ban he has disputed, but which nonetheless kept him off the sport's biggest stages during what should have been his most competitive years. What it gave the sport, however, was something compliant behavior never could. It gave bodybuilding a figure who looked at the gap between what the sport claimed to be and what it actually was, and refused to pretend the gap did not exist. Someone who said, plainly and on the record, that athletes deserved better pay. That drug use was real and widespread, and that lying about it served no one. That exclusivity contracts gave athletes little in return for a great deal. That the scoring at major events was not always determined by the physiques on display. None of this was secret. Most serious insiders knew it to be true. What was rare, almost uniquely rare, was someone saying it publicly, with their name attached, while still competing. The car accident in 2014 took things Lee Priest had not imagined could be taken from him. The physical capabilities he had spent 30 years building. The symmetry that had defined his competitive identity. The simple daily act of walking into a gym and knowing his body would respond the way it always had. He lost those things for years, and in losing them discovered how much of his sense of self had been built around his identity as a bodybuilder. Which is to say, nearly all of it. The painkiller dependency, the withdrawal, the suicidal ideation. These were the experiences of a man who had been stripped of everything he understood about himself and was working to find a reason to continue. That he did, that he came through it, that he emerged still training and still speaking and still a recognizable presence in bodybuilding's digital spaces. That is not a minor outcome. It is a genuinely remarkable human story. Lee Priest lost a great deal across this period. The ban, the accident, the addiction, the worst of his own thinking. He lost things he cannot fully recover. But the things he gave up are not what his legacy rests on. His legacy rests on the fact that every time the sport attempted to diminish him, to contain him, punish him into compliance, dismiss him, or simply outlast him, Lee Priest declined to cooperate. He declined when they told him he was too young for his pro card. He declined when they told him to skip England. He did not pretend steroids were not part of the sport. He did not stay quiet about athlete pay. He did not disappear after the accident altered what his body could do. By any fair accounting, he is one of the most straightforwardly honest figures the sport has produced. And honesty in an industry built on carefully managed image is an uncomfortable thing to bring into the room. The questions he raised have not gone away. The athlete pay debates he provoked in 2002 and 2003 evolved into conversations that continue in bodybuilding circles today. The political structures he challenged have shifted, reorganized, and in some cases dissolved entirely. The athletes who stayed quiet and kept their heads down have, for the most part, faded from public memory. Lee Priest, banned for life, seriously injured in a car accident, carrying a face tattoo he got, had removed and then got again, living with a pet fox named Carlos, is still here, still talking, still immediately recognizable to anyone who follows the sport. That may be the most fitting outcome available to him. Not an Olympia title, not the Federation's endorsement, not a quiet retirement and a legacy plaque. Instead, something less conventional and more durable. A reputation, permanent and unambiguous, as a man who refused to be anything other than exactly what he was, regardless of what it cost him. In a sport full of competitors who made their accommodations, the 5'4" Australian who never did is the one people are still talking about.